Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We had quite a few registrations and we're sure glad to see you today. My name is Tosh Weismiller. I'm the program manager of the Community and Economic Vitality Program here in the Montana Department of Commerce. In my role, I oversee numerous different programs, one of which is the one you'll hear about today, the Montana Historic Preservation Grant Program. But in addition to that, this team that you'll hear from today, Taylor, Mackenzie, and myself, all work in areas including the Montana Main Street Program, community development block grants for economic development, and community facilities. And so we've been doing work all across the state for many years and have worked with many of you. I see some of the names on here, so we're not seeing your faces, but we sure recognize the names. But thank you for joining us today. I really want to thank you for the work that you do for your communities and your organizations across the state. We're really excited to have another round of grant submissions with some great ideas and projects across the state that really point to the importance of our museums and our historic preservation and projects and historic structures across the state. So thank you so much. In the last grant cycle, the inaugural cycle, $5.6 million was awarded to 26 projects across the entire state. We had small rural communities, we had larger communities, we had different types of projects, museums, historical sites, and historical societies. And this was, that $5.6 million was the largest investment of funds in historic preservation in the history of this state. That's so significant to me and the work that we do and the buildings and museums that you care about. So we're really excited today to start anew on a new cycle and talk through our program and hear from you. And so most importantly, after this initial webinar, which will be recorded, of course, we really encourage you to please feel free to reach out to us following this. Let's talk about your ideas. Let's talk about any concerns you have. So if you go through this and there's a section here and you don't get a chance to really think over your question and you want to connect with us, feel free to email, to call us. We could show up at your museum and have a conversation if time allows and if travel is appropriate. So, please don't be discouraged if you're a smaller museum looking at these sorts of projects and needs and it's larger than you're used to for a project. Let's talk through that and Taylor and Mackenzie are gonna go through a lot of the details here. We're all available to help. So and we're really committed to, we love history, we love museums, we love historic preservation projects. So I really encourage you to going forward, talk about ideas. And if you're not an applicant in this round, let's talk about the round to follow in future years. So thank you, all of you. Taylor and Mackenzie, I will hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Tosh. To second what Tosh said, thanks everybody for joining today. My name is Mackenzie Esplin, so I'm going to start off here, and Taylor and I will kind of be switching back and forth depending on the section and moving forward here. So on this webinar, we're going to walk you guys through the program guidelines, the application process, the environmental review process, and then some of our FAQs towards the end. The program was a state-funded program created in 2019 as a result of Senate Bill 338, sections 1 through 17. It's an ongoing program with a grant cycle every 2 years, and awards are made as part of the legislative session. The program was funded through an increase in the bed tax. It was designed to support public or private entities with the preservation of historic sites, historical societies, or history museums through grant funding and demonstrating that economic impact of historical resources throughout the state. It provides the opportunity to stimulate economic development, community revitalization, and statewide tourism through increased investment, job creation or retention, business expansion, and local tax base growth. It was designed in a way to support a variety of activities and historic resources. The grants can be used to leverage additional funding resources, tax credits. It can better position historic sites and museums for success address critical needs, and kind of provide that financial catalyst to unlock economic and heritage potential for Montana's historic resources. First, we'll just start with eligible applicants. So there's kind of three categories here. We have persons, so that's individuals applying for a fiscal agent. Fiscal agent just meaning, like it says below, could be a local government, it could be another nonprofit, could be a CRDC. It's applying through some sort of partnership who takes part ownership of that project as well. They can also apply directly in coordination with the local government. An association here is defined as for-profits or not-for-profit organizations and businesses. That includes our museums, could be a nonprofit that supports a historic site, something like that. And then of course, governing units, we have incorporated cities and towns, counties, could be a consolidated government, could be representative of a governing unit, such as like a library or a school district, and then tribal governments. There is match requirement, and it differs depending on what kind of project you are. A 20% match of the total estimated project cost is required for applications submitted by governing units. And then a 20% match of the total grant request is required for applications submitted by other entities. So that does make a little bit of a difference there. What we consider eligible match, there's many ways to do this. You can come in with match for cash, other grants, loans, other forms of capital. We are accepting in-kind contributions at a rate of $20 per hour. If you've done phases or components of the preservation of the historic site, historical society, or history museum, that can be considered eligible match. Aspects of the project that were done, such as a planning component preceding the application, can be considered eligible match. The key is it just has to kind of tie into that project that you're coming in for. It can't kind of be something done maybe 10 years ago or not related. It has to be close to the time that you're coming in, and then also related directly to the project. So you don't have to secure match before applying, but documentation of match is required after awards are made, and committed match, if it's already there, may score higher on the statutory criteria during ranking. I'm going to hand this off to Taylor now for a bit.
Thanks, Mackenzie. So eligible applicants can apply to complete projects or activities for the preservation of historic sites, historical societies, or history museums. And these eligible project types kind of fall within three categories, or they might overlap in between these three categories. So the first is internal or external brick and mortar improvements that will address infrastructure, building renovation, maintenance, or building code issues. The second being improvements that will enhance security, climate control, or fire protection. And then the third being projects with a total cost over $50,000 may use up to 10% of their grant funding for planning or grant administration costs that are direct related to the preservation activities in kind of the Group A or Group B. So as an example for that Group C, if a history museum is applying for $100,000 for HVAC improvements, they could spend $10,000 or 10% of that award on staff time to meet grant requirements. Or if they don't have the capacity to do that themselves, they could hire a grant administrator or an accountant to handle components of the grant. In addition, if a historic site is applying for $300,000 in interior or exterior renovations, they could spend $30,000 or 10% of that award towards a PAR if that needs to be completed as an aspect of that project. For all three of these different buckets, the project should be directly linked to the preservation of a historic resource or collection. For example, if a historical society is applying for building improvements or new construction, the project needs to be linked to better preserving their historical resources or collections, such as expanded space to properly store or display these materials, and this should be clearly articulated within the application. So for historical societies and history museums, that'll be pretty evident if you're applying within that category. But if you're wanting to apply within historic sites, for the purposes of the MHPG program, we define historic sites and you're considered eligible if you meet one of the following 3 criteria. The first being that your structure site is listed on the national, state, or local historic registry. Suitable documentation to this effect could include registry paperwork, and that should be submitted along with your application. And this kind of consideration for eligibility should be listed and explained within the narrative of the application itself. Another way is if your structure or site contributes to historic district, suitable documentation to that effect could include registry paperwork that pertains to that specific structure or site. And then the third way is if your structure is more than 50 years old and has documented significance to the history of a Montana community or region. And suitable documentation to this effect could include a letter of support from your local preservation commission or preservation officer. The narrative answers in your application should demonstrate how your historic site meets one of these 3 criteria, and you should attach suitable documentation to your application. Therefore, along with a history museum or history society, a historic hotel, a historic theater, historic school, historic courthouse, or a historic downtown property would be eligible for the MHPG program. In terms of eligible funding, eligible applicants may apply for up to $500,000 per eligible project. During our inaugural round of MHPG projects, our smallest project that the legislature funded was $4,904, and our largest project was $500,000. So there's really a lot of variability to the amount of funds that can be applied for. We do ask that there's only 1 application per project. For example, if a property like a historic library is owned by the city, but there's also a nonprofit that raises funds for the structure, the city and the nonprofit should not both be submitting separate applications for the same historic library. MHPG applicants that were not awarded during the previous application cycle are encouraged to apply again, and MHPG grantees that were awarded during the previous application cycle may apply during the current application cycle. However, if their project is not complete or nearing completion, they may rank lower on certain statutory criteria, which we'll get to later. The funds that are available for MHPG projects that will be available during the 2023 legislative session is derived from the lodging sales tax allocated in MCA 15-68-820 3B and 4C, which is deposited into the Historic Preservation Grant account. At this time, we don't know what is projected for this account. However, as Tash mentioned, during the 2021 legislative session, the legislature appropriated around $5.4 million for MHPG grants from this account. Applications are due by midnight on February 28th, 2022. Applications received after this date will not be considered. Complete applications will include Appendix A, which is the application and narrative responses to the criteria. It'll also include Appendix B, which is the completed environmental review forms, and this should include documentation of public meeting or any other supporting documentation for that environmental review process. And then it can include associated documents. This may include photos that convey the deficiencies and work proposed in the application, or letters of support from a couple of project partners or stakeholders. It might include planning documents such as a PAR or feasibility study or other architectural, engineering, or design documents. And it might include paperwork that supports or clarifies that the property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. As I mentioned, these associated documents are not required, but they provide important information and context for your project that greatly helps the review team. One hard copy or one electronic copy of a complete application, which again includes all of these 3 components bolded on this slide, should be postmarked or submitted to Commerce by midnight on February 28th, 2022. If you are submitting a hard copy of a complete application, it should be sent to the address on the screen, which is Department of Commerce, 301 South Park Avenue, P.O. Box 200523, Helena, Montana 59620. If you are submitting an electronic copy of a complete application, it should be sent via the file transfer service at transfer.mt.gov. To do this, applicants will need to create an account in the file transfer service, upload all of the associated files, and email them in the system to docfts@mt.gov. If you have any questions about the file transfer process, Commerce staff can walk you through it. We don't have a preference between a hard copy or an electronic copy, but you don't need to submit both. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Mackenzie to discuss some of the projects that were funded during the inaugural round of MHPG, and we hope these examples help everyone to think about the universe of projects that are eligible.
Thanks, Taylor. This is the Northwest Historical Museum in Kalispell, Montana. It's located in the historic Central School building. They were awarded $58,385 to flush and clean the HVAC system. That's going to rectify heating and cooling deficiencies. Those deficiencies were threatening their collection and was decreasing the comfort of visitors. They hold a lot of programs during the winter. Throughout the year, they have schools coming in and they have all sorts of events. And so that was really limiting what they could do just due to the level of heat that was available in the building. So the museum houses 45,000 artifacts, photographs, records, and documents that tell the story of Northwest Montana. They have a meeting space that hosts 100+ events and educational programs a year. This was a really good example of a project. They were addressing a really critical need, the heating and cooling. It came in, they had a very much pinpointed what they needed and why. The economic impact of this museum, they're a great resource in the community. They provide a lot of educational programs. It's a historic building and a historic museum. So this was just a really good example of a critically needed project in a great resource in the community. This one is a little different. This was through a nonprofit called Preservation Cascade. They were awarded for the historic 10th Street Bridge in Great Falls. It's now known as the Arlene Reichert Community Heritage Bridge. The award was for $125,000 to the baluster and safety railings. Currently, the only way for pedestrians in Great Falls to cross the river in the area is on 2 other vehicular bridges. And so parts of this bridge can be used, but the entire span was not open to the public. It just wasn't safe due to those missing baluster railings. So with the grant and the renovations, it's going to allow the bridge to become fully functional. That's going to increase pedestrian access to both sides of the river and to local businesses. It activates, both sides of the bridges economically. It increases walkability of the area, and it helps with overall safety of the bridge. Another great project example from the last cycle that has actually finished up already. So this was the Yucca Theater in Hysham. It's built in 1931 and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The entire complex consists of the Yucca Theater, the Manning Home, and a museum. For this, the interior west wall and ceiling of the Yucca Theater was showing moisture damage. The moisture was getting in on that top vega structure near the balcony wall. As a result, the surface of the wall was powdering away and the ceiling was showing up to 2 feet across with water spots. So it was a pretty big emergency issue with the water damage that could potentially happen there. They were awarded, the Treasure County 89ers Museum Board, $23,300 to repair the roof and prevent further water damage. And we were able to work on that project and get that done pretty quickly and successfully to make sure that that critical need was addressed. And again, that was kind of a really critical need. They really showed in the application that this was an emergency situation, why the structure was so important, what it meant to the community of Hysham, and it was just a really good project example. I'll turn it over to some of Taylor's projects.
Great. So another project example is the Crowley Block, which is located in downtown Lewistown and was purchased by Bighorn Valley Health Center, which is one of the 14 community health centers in Montana that provides healthcare services regardless of ability to pay or insurance status. The Crowley Block through Bighorn Valley Health Center was awarded $412,535 to preserve the historical characteristics of the interior and exterior of the building. This includes facade improvements and restoration of historic windows, doors, floors, ceilings, and associated features. This work is part of an $8.6 million rehabilitation of the Crowley Block, which is being done at the same time. And all of this work will allow a satellite clinic for Bighorn Valley Health Center to open an outpatient primary health center on the basement and first floor of the building and mezzanine. And then homeward, another nonprofit is converting the second and third floors, which have been vacant since the 1940s, into affordable housing for low-income families. This is a great example of how MHPG funds were able to fill a funding gap for a nonprofit applicant, ensuring that the renovation of this historic site was done in a way that preserves the historical integrity of the building. In addition, this project has an economic and social impact. It creates more than 20 full-time jobs within the clinic. It will locate an outpatient primary health center in downtown Lewistown, which will bring folks in to the commercial district, and it will create affordable housing within a community that desperately needs it. And affordable housing that's downtown and walkable. Yeah. Another example is the Ringling Mansion in White Sulphur Springs, which is owned by Sarah Calhoun LLC. Ringling Mansion via Sarah Calhoun LLC was awarded $89,500 to reconstruct the historic wraparound porch on the property, and to do this in a way that included an ADA ramp to ensure that the property is accessible to the public. And they're also going to work with a contractor to list the property on the National Register of Historic Places. This more limited work is being done at the same time as other renovations to the property, which will allow the Ringling Mansion to house the Red Ants Pants Foundation, along with community space for events and pop-up businesses on the first floor and artists and residents on the second floor, which, fun fact, I'm not sure if you guys know this, but I wrote this House of Sky on the second floor of the Ringling Mansion. So kind of a cool secondary component of this property. This is a great example of a for-profit project. The applicant was able to demonstrate that the rehabilitation of the historic site would have a community-wide social and economic benefit that merited receiving grant funds. In addition, this is a great example of using a portion of MHPG funding for planning and/or grant administration. Since this grantee was awarded more than $50,000, they decided to use 10% or less of their award to list the property on the National Register of Historic Places, which will ensure that it's recognized and potentially lead to other funding sources to become available. The final example is Spotted Bear Ranger Station and Museum, which is located within the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex and maintained by the National Forest Foundation. Spotted Bear Ranger Station and Museum via the National Forest Foundation was awarded $72,000 for improvements to the museum. This included a new security system and cases and displays to ensure that the museum is self-guided, along with HVAC improvements that ensure that the structure is comfortable for visitors during shoulder season. This work is being done at the same time as other rehabilitation on this historic structure, which was conducted through a Forest Service grant and in-kind labor from the Forest Service and volunteers. This is an example of a nonprofit that received MHPG funds for both a historic site and a history museum. This project will allow the Spotted Bear Ranger Station, which is a great tourism asset for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, to be open for extended hours, since it's now self-guided and comfortable for visitors. In addition, the National Forest Foundation used in-kind match to meet the match requirement for this program. As I mentioned, during the last cycle, the legislature funded projects that range from $5,000 to $500,000, and they funded historic sites, historical societies, history museums for local government, nonprofit, and for-profit grantees. So there's a wide array of projects that are eligible for the MHPG program. Having said this, applicants should submit applications that are comprised of standalone activities. In other words, preliminary work where a substantive improvement would only happen after additional funds are obtained and the project is completed is not a good fit for the MHPG program because it's difficult to demonstrate the return on investment after our funds are involved. Applicants can submit applications that contain multiple standalone activities. For example, a history museum could apply for roof repairs and facade improvements that will ensure that there are no leaks onto their collections and that their building receives a facelift so the structure is sound and visitors are encouraged to stop by. Nevertheless, we would encourage applicants to submit applications to not submit applications that contain everything in the kitchen sink. as we've colloquially been calling it. For example, applications that ask for every single repair just so they can get up to the maximum $500,000 award. From the previous round of MHPG, these applications did not score as high on some of the statutory criteria, such as purpose and need. In general, when thinking about potential projects, we encourage applicants to consider improvements that increase access and use of the historic resource, that activate unused spaces, that improve access and safety concerns, that improve interpretive content in the displays or storage of artifacts or the collection, that improve net operating costs to ensure that these limited resources are put towards other priorities, and for improvements that increase visitation and use. So the selection process for MHPG is a little bit different than other grant programs. The turnaround time between application and award is around 15 months. So we want to walk you through that process, which is legislatively mandated per Senate Bill 338, which established the program. Commerce staff has no decision-making authority over any application and only provides recommendations to the legislature that are advisory. Commerce will present recommendations to the legislature by the 15th day of the regular legislative session, and the legislature will make the funding decisions. To prepare the recommendations, Commerce will review all applications in consultation with the Tourism Advisory Council, known as TAC, and the State Historic Preservation Office, known as SHPO, before they are submitted to the legislature. Commerce may take additional information into account based on Commerce's or other agency knowledge about a proposed project or community in the scoring of an application. Commerce staff will review applications based on the extent to which the proposed project relates to each of the 6 statutory criteria found in Senate Bill 338 and the application guidelines, and the applicant may not submit any additional information after the application deadline unless requested by Commerce staff or as part of the environmental review process, or in order to clarify information already presented in the application. When awards are made during the 2023 legislative session, awarded applicants can begin to incur project costs after the bill that includes the MHPG projects become law. Last year, this happened around late April or early May. In developing the scope and timeline of your application, we encourage you to consider this longer application timeline between application and award because it may influence the priority of projects or timing of leveraged funds. Since these are state funds, if you are awarded, there is documentation with state requirements that will be needed to access these funds. The details on this slide are not as important in this stage of the process, but we want to make sure that applicants understand that if awarded, they will have to enter into a contract with Commerce to access these funds, and they will have to comply with various state rules and regulations involving procurement, insurance, and reporting. So this is just a timeline that we drew up for our current round of MHPG grantees that walks them through the various stages in the process once they were awarded. So they were awarded funds in May 2023, then they had to complete startup conditions with Commerce in order to enter into a contract. Once they were in a contract with Commerce, they could access those funds, but they needed to make sure that they were procuring for any supplies, services that would be paid for in whole or in part with MHPG funds per the proper procurement standards. Then they began construction and then submitted requests for funds, and then they closed out their projects. As we have alluded to, Senate Bill 338, which established the program, outlines 6 statutory criteria that Commerce must use to review and rank applications. These criteria are listed on the screen. The first one is the degree to which the project supports economic stimulus or economic activity, including job creation and work creation for Montana contractors and service workers. During the last round of MHPG applications, applications that ranked high in this criteria described the jobs that were created as the project was being undertaken. For example, they quantified the number of contractors or architects or other individuals that would be working on the project, along with spillover benefits such as, they would stay in town and would frequent restaurants or other things in the community. And again, projects that quantified this statutory criteria tended to do better than others. Statutory criteria B is the degree to which the project activity can demonstrate the purpose and need of the project. This includes whether it provides features that establish or enhance security, climate control, or fire protection for museums, or address infrastructure, maintenance, or building code issues for museums, historical societies, or historic sites. Again, projects that described in detail the deficiency that the project would address, how the project was prioritized, for example, was the roof going to fail sometime soon, and whether other funds were considered or available tended to score higher in the statutory criteria. Statutory criteria C is the degree to which timing of the project can be completed without delay, including access to matching funds and approval of permits if needed. For projects that score high in this criteria, they described the applicant's capacity, whether or not matching funds were or would be in place, and the various timeline considerations such as permitting or environmental considerations. In other words, applicants that scored high in this criteria assured the review team that the project would move forward quickly after award. For statutory criteria C, that's the degree to which the project activity contributes historic or heritage value related to the state of Montana. Projects that scored high in this statutory criteria describe the context and significance of the historic site, historical society, or history museum, and its collections. Statutory criteria E is the degree to which the applicant demonstrates a successful track record or experience of the organization directing the project. Applicants that scored high in this criteria describe the applicant's familiarity with this type of project. In essence, they assured the review team that the organization could take on this project and all of the grants administration. And then statutory criteria F is the degree to which the project's expected ongoing economic benefit to the state as a result of the project completion. And applicants that scored well in statutory criteria F describe the ongoing economic benefit. For example, is there increased tourism? Are there operating costs that then can be used to create different programs at a museum or historical society? Are there future phases of work that are only possible after this project is complete, and those future phases will do X, Y, and Z? Does this project work towards community goals, such as getting a small business into a vacant building downtown that encourages other businesses to relocate nearby? And kind of just a quick nuance, the difference a little bit between statutory criteria A and F is A is really looking at the current economic benefit as the project is being undertaken, and then F is the ongoing economic benefit. The application encourages all applicants to think about all of these nuances in the 6 statutory criteria with sub-questions. So please make sure that you're answering all of those to get all of the different nuances of the application and its question. Applications will receive an aggregated score based on each criteria. So a lower score in one criteria in an otherwise strong application does not mean that the proposed project is not competitive. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mackenzie to go over environmental review.
Thanks, Matt. All MHPG projects are required to follow the environmental review process and are subject to MHPA or the Montana Environmental Policy Act. We know this process can seem cumbersome, but mostly it's about making sure the public has a say in the project or the ability to comment, and that all potential impacts of a given project are taken into consideration. All applicants must determine a finding level, discuss the project and finding level at a public meeting, and make a final determination. And that's the very high level of the environmental review process. We detailed this out kind of step by step in the following slides, and it's available in Appendix B of our application. So step 1, all applicants designate an environmental certifying officer. So this individual is responsible for ensuring the environmental review is completed, for signing final environmental determinations. This would be for a local government, a mayor, chief executive officer. For businesses or nonprofits, this could be the owner, CEO, or an executive director. It's kind of the person who would be responsible ultimately for the organization, kind of largely public facing. So an authorized representative can complete the environmental review process. So you could have, if you have, I'm trying to think here, like a grant administrator or someone like that, they could do the environmental review process, but that environmental certifying officer has to sign off on everything. For step 2, all applicants determine and review their proposed scope of work. So you're going to clearly define this proposed scope of work for the project and the activities involved, such as exterior repointing, climate or security system installation, roof replacement. You're considering the larger effects of the entire project as well, not just the portion for which MHPG funds would be directed. A good example of that is if you're coming in for climate control systems for, say, a museum expansion, you're not just considering the potential environmental impacts of the fire climate control system, you're looking at the potential environmental impacts of the new construction as well, the entire project. So you're also going to identify any agencies or groups which may have a vested interest in the project or from whom any licenses or permits are required. Step 3 is all applicants are going to determine if the proposed project is considered exempt from MHPA review. MHPA specifies 3 different levels of environmental review based on the significance of the potential impacts. These levels are 1, exempt or excluded from MHPA review, 2, environmental assessment, or 3, environmental impact statement. Due to the nature of the project types, most of our applicants are going to fall under exempt or excluded. They're seldom going to require an environmental impact statement. And if this level is anticipated, we highly recommend that you contact us immediately, as that has additional steps and time that we wouldn't go into here, but that would be really highly unlikely. So projects listed as statutorily or categorically exempt from MHPA review are not required to complete the environmental assessment, which is our environmental checklist appendix B2. If a typically exempt activity can cause significant public controversy related to its effect on the human environment or may affect sensitive cultural or environmental resources, proceeding with that environmental assessment is still advised. So typical activities which are exempt under 8.2.3045 include administrative actions, routine clerical or similar functions, including but not limited to administrative procurement, contracts for consulting services or personnel actions. That's most likely not going to be the case on these projects because we're going to be doing kind of bricks and mortar and tangible things. Minor repairs, operations and maintenance of existing equipment or facilities. Some of the projects may fall under that. Projects that involve only minor repairs or rehabilitation to an existing facility, including functional replacement of an existing facility or facility components. So that could be roof replacement, that could be replacement of heating, cooling, HVAC. That would still follow under those exempt activities. If you're thinking about new construction, say you're coming in for a reconstruction of a historic building, or it's like a large scale expansion, or you're coming in for fire control on a completely new construction, that's most likely going to require the full environmental assessment, environmental checklist appendix B2. So again, if a project is not exempt, an environmental assessment or environmental checklist appendix B2 must be completed. And it's kind of interesting because the word exempt, and then they're calling it MHPA review. The projects that are exempt don't have to do the MHPA review, but they have to go through the MHPA process. That's why all applicants have to go through some of these steps. And I'll have an overview of, even if you're exempt, what you need to submit towards the end. So step 4, all projects proceed with a public process and hold a public meeting, regardless of the expected level of review. So this meeting can be a standalone event or included on the agenda of another meeting, such as a council, a board meeting, or public presentation about the proposed project. It's important the public is made aware of the meeting and has a reasonable opportunity to attend. When advertising for a public meeting, applicants should follow their standard processes for engaging the public, should make efforts to ensure the public is made aware, You can post on Facebook, you can post on your website, you can place ads in the local paper. Kind of, these are all ways of ensuring the public is made aware of the meeting. And we don't necessarily have a one size fits all situation, especially with our variety of applicants. So it's making sure that you're getting it out there best you can and in the avenues that you're familiar with. That could be your newsletter. Maybe you have an email list and you can send that out. It can be at your normal board meeting. You can have it at your facility. We're pretty flexible with how the public meeting takes place. It just needs to be public. So some things, if you did an advertisement, that it should include description of the project, reason for the meeting, name of the applicant, time and location, should be posted most likely at least 48 to 72 hours in advance, should be held at a time and place that facilitates public participation. We are allowing virtual meetings as well. A lot of applicants did that last cycle. That's the times we're living in currently. So that's not required that it's necessarily in person. You want to make sure you record as best you can the attendance and any public comments regarding the project and environmental process. You can respond to any comments which can be easily addressed within the meeting. You can also respond to those comments later on, just making sure that you keep records of all of that. After the public meeting, you're going to make a final environmental determination. If there was no controversy that indicated you need to do further review or anything like that, you're going to make that final environmental determination and sign off on that. Let's see, just trying to think of anything else related to the meetings here. I think probably plenty, and we'll go through the whole process. I have a handy sheet further on too. Step 5, this is kind of what I was mentioning before. After that public meeting, you're going to be making that final environmental determination. So for MHPG projects, that's going to be, again, exempt or environmental assessment. And if you've completed your EA, but there was so much controversy related to the project that it requires providing that EIS, please contact us. Again, that's going to be extremely rare. Step 6, all applicants complete the environmental review form. This provides a summary of the proposed project, the environmental determination level, and the detail of the public process that was followed to arrive at the final determination. This form is going to be signed by the environmental certifying official. It's a simple one-pager. You can find this on our website. It has 6 questions on it, so it does require a small bit of narrative for each, but it's not as intense as it sounds. And so once everything's done, the environmental certifying official is again signing off on that environmental determination. We have a resolution, sample resolutions for them to sign. We have them both for governmental and non-governmental applicants. So that is on our website. And that is also a one-pager. It's just saying, yes, we are exempt, and they're signing off on that. Or we're saying, yes, we had to do an EA, but there were no large controversy or impacts that need further review. And then they're signing off on that as well. Okay, so step 8 is submitting all required documents to us along with the application. I've done it in 2 ways here. So if you are an exempt project, you are going to be submitting 3 things, basically. You're going to be submitting the Appendix B1, the environmental review form. That's the one-pager with the 6 questions. You're going to submit the resolution to accept a termination. That's the ECO signing off that, yes, we're exempt. That's also a 1-page. And then just documentation of your public process, including your meeting minutes. So however that meeting took place, if you did the advertisements, if you sent it in newsletters, emails, copies of however you advertised it, attendees, meeting minutes, like I said, anything like that. Those are the 3 main things. If you were considered non-exempt, you submit the environmental review form, the 1-page 6 questions, the resolution to accept a termination, again, that's a 1-pager, the documentation of the public process, the environmental assessment checklist, that's the full multi-page environmental checklist, Appendix B2, and then any supporting environmental determination that informed your environmental assessment checklist. So this is handy to keep in mind that all applicants have to do environmental, but if you're exempt, those are the things you submit, and then if you're not exempt, those are the things you have to submit there. Okay, so I'm going to quickly walk through this process a couple different ways. This is kind of handy. I like this, it's all in one page, which is how my mind thinks. So if you're a non-exempt project, let's do exempt first. If you're an exempt project, you're going to designate your environmental certifying officer at top. You're going to determine and review your scope of work, determine if you're exempt. Yes, you are. Project is exempt. You're going to proceed with public process. Were there any comments during that public meeting that led to any controversy or that you couldn't address? No. You make your final environmental determination. You complete the B1, that's the 1-page form with the 6 questions. The ECO is signing off on these 2 things, and then you're submitting everything to us. So it's a pretty straightforward process. If you are not exempt, again, you're going to do these 3 things. You're not exempt, you're going to have to do the environmental assessment. That's the appendix B2. Then have your public meeting. If there's no controversy in that meeting, you're going to, again, make that determination, complete the B1, he signs these 2 forms, and you submit everything. The weirdness happens if you're exempt, you have your public meeting, and there's a lot of controversy. If there's a lot of controversy, you may have to hold additional public meetings to respond, or go up and complete an environmental assessment. That's pretty rare. And if something like that happens during your meeting, you can definitely call us and we can walk you through that. But that most likely, I don't think our projects will typically have a lot of controversy, but it's good to be prepared for any situation. And that is the overview of the environmental review. I'll hand it back to Taylor.
Great. So for the purpose of this webinar, we're not going to dive into grant administration. However, as I mentioned, applicants who are awarded funds must complete startup conditions and contract with Commerce to access these funds, and grantees will be required to follow applicable state regulations and processes. Therefore, we encourage applicants to look at the MHPG Project Administration Manual, which is on our website, to understand these various requirements. If awarded, we will conduct a webinar on grant administration after the 2023 legislative session to ensure that all projects have all of the information that they need to succeed. And again, for grants of $50,000 or more, 10% of the award can go towards grant administration to ensure that an organization has the capacity to comply with all of these state regulations and processes. To learn more about the program, the MHPG guidelines, application, appendices, and project administration manual are all on our website, which is listed here on the screen. As Tosh mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, please feel free to contact us at any point between now and February 28th when applications are due, or even after February 28th if you had questions about the process, or if you're looking about projects for the next round of funding. We're always here as a resource. For general questions regarding historic preservation, and particularly for any questions regarding historic tax credits, please contact the State Historic Preservation Office, and we'll have their contact information on a following slide. SHPO and Commerce are both here as resources to help projects succeed to unlock the potential of Montana's treasured historic resources. So next, we're going to get into some frequently asked questions, or FAQs, that we had during the inaugural round of MHPG funding to hopefully kind of assuage any concerns or questions that have arisen. The first one is whether MHPG funds can be used for operations. And unfortunately, operational expenses are not eligible for funding per Senate Bill 338, which established the MHPG program. The second question that we often get is, can an applicant apply for more than one grant? Yes, multiple applications can be submitted by one applicant for different projects, and that's the key. So multiple applicants cannot apply for the same project. For example, local government might apply for needed improvements to multiple historic buildings, but may not apply for multiple grants for a single building. Similarly, a nonprofit and business cannot both submit applications for the same building or historic site. Another question that we get is when will funds be available? The answer to this is awards will be made during the 2023 legislative session. Once the legislature passes the bill, it will then be submitted to the governor for signature to become effective. The date that the bill becomes effective will be the official award date. After this date, grantees may incur reimbursable project costs, and activities before this date cannot be reimbursed with MHPG funds. Again, last year this happened in late April or early May. Another question that we get are whether funds are required up front. And the answer is no. The MHPG program does not require funds up front. Project funds are dispersed by submitting a request for funds and applicable invoices to Commerce. Projects may have multiple requests for funds depending on the project size, timeline, and budget. Typically, invoices require payment within 30 days, allowing time for grantees to submit a request for funds from Commerce before the invoice is due. While we do request 7 to 10 business days to process requests for funds, our team recognizes the need to expedite these as quickly as possible. With this timeline, the funds will be in the MHPG grantee's bank account with time to pay the contractor. Our team will be in regular communication with each grantee throughout the startup, request for funds, and closeout process. So again, funds are not required upfront. Another question we get is, do I need a strategic plan, operational plan, or fully audited financials to apply for the program? No. Applicants are not required to conduct strategic plans, operating plans, or fully audited financials to be eligible or competitive for MHPG funding. As part of the application process, providing such materials when available helps to set the context of the institution and the project. Applicants should feel comfortable submitting any plans that were created, whether that is succinct, board-created annual strategy, or a full-scale strategic plan. If a plan is not available, then an organization can articulate its goals in response to the application questions. Another question we get is, can I submit supplemental materials such as photos and letters? And the answer is yes. Supplemental materials such as photos, letters of support, and National Register of Historic Place nominations can be included with an MHPG application, but they are not required. These supplemental materials are helpful because they provide the review team with a sense of the project and its community support, and they substantiate the narrative and the MHPG application. When considering supplemental materials, please be considerate of the time and attention that the review team puts into each application. For example, applicants are encouraged to submit a couple of key letters of support, such as one from the local government, one from the Chamber of Commerce, and one from the business community, rather than an exhaustive list. And the final question that we get a lot is, what does the legislative process involve? And the answer is, Commerce has no decision-making authority over any application and only provides advisory recommendations to the legislature. During the legislative session, the legislature will review Commerce's advisory recommendations and consider each application. During this process, MHPG applicants will have the opportunity to testify on behalf of their project. MHPG applicants are encouraged to testify and share an overview of their project, its importance, its impact, and any applicable updates. Commerce will communicate the date, time, and details of this process with MHPG applicants as soon as practicable. As I mentioned, if you have any questions about historic tax credits or broader historic preservation questions, we encourage you to reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office at 406-444-7715 or MT-SHPO, SHPO at mt.gov. They're a great resource and collaborator on this project. And if you have any questions about the Montana Historic Preservation Grant Program, you can reach out to us. Our main line here at the Community Development Division is 406-841-2770, and our main email is doccdd@mt.gov. If you email or call either of those, it'll eventually find its way to one of the three of us, but you're also welcome to contact us directly. Tosh, Mackenzie, and my emails and phone numbers are listed on the screen along with our website. And with that, we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions at this time, please pop them in the Q&A to make sure that we're keeping track of all of them. If you're on the phone and have a question, please press *9 to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you, and then press *6 to unmute or remute yourself. And with that, I know we've been answering a couple of questions in the chat throughout the webinar. So I'm going to quickly read through them and see if there's any that we should verbally answer as well that we've already answered. And Mackenzie and Tosh, please feel free to do the same. I think we had one question for the good of the group about the Paris Gibson Square Museum of Art in Great Falls. The question was, this is an art museum, not a history museum, although it's in a building that's 126 years old that's listed on the National Registry of Historic Places. So would they be eligible? And Tosh answered, and the answer is yes. They would be eligible under historic sites because of the building and the preservation activities related to the building.
And I think there's some environmental ones here in the Q&A, Taylor, so maybe I'll just kind of go through those quickly if that's okay. When we're talking about the environmental certifying officer or the executive applicant, again, that's kind of determined by you all as the applicants. It's really straightforward. When it's a city or county, then it's the chief executive or the mayor. If it's a nonprofit, that could be a board member, a chair board member, that could be the executive director. If it's a business, that could be, say, the president or CEO or owner of the building. So it's someone who's going to kind of ultimately be the responsible entity for the project. And then the other question for the environmental, with the public meeting, about if there's questions or concerns coming from the general public, and if there's a requirement for any official representatives of some kind. So there's not any requirement for any official representative of an entity, but we do recommend that if you're presenting on a project, if you're a nonprofit, having some board members or having the executive director there who's kind of spearheading the projects or very involved with the activities, having them there is great. Having a mayor involved or city council, things like that, that's always recommended, but it's not required. And then if there are questions or concerns from the public, you would most likely be addressing those during the meeting and just submitting that to us. There's generally not going to be concerns or questions coming from the community about the project that you're not going to be able to address right there in the meeting. If there is some people who say, for example, aren't necessarily happy with the project and they want to make that comment, that's fine. That's on record and you could submit that to us, but that doesn't change the environmental aspects of it. The concerns that we'd be looking at in an environmental process is if someone has comments about the environmental impacts of a project, that would be some concerns or comments that you might need to hold an additional meeting about, or do an EA, but you can always contact us if that situation arises and we can guide you through that. I hope that answered those questions.
Yeah, I think that sounded great, Mackenzie. I was just looking through a couple of other answered questions that we just wanted to mention out loud because I think they would be good for the good of the group. Someone had a question about maybe having different projects and whether, for example, one's for bat mitigation, one's for floor repairs, should that be submitted in separate applications or in the same application? And as Tosh mentioned in the answered questions, that should be submitted as one application. But you would want to show that both are urgently needed, for example, preventing further damage and safety accessibility concerns. And we had another question, which I think is especially prudent given construction costs these days, is given the 15-month timeline, is it advisable to include a contingency percentage into the project's proposed cost, given that we can't predict materials or labor increases? And yes, including some sort of contingency we think is wise and a good practice overall, especially given MHPG's 15-month timeline. Having said that, it's always a great idea to connect with us to make sure that if you have any questions about what's applicable for the budget of your proposal, we can answer those on a one-on-one basis. In the unanswered questions, I'll just answer this live. So we had a question about whether if funds are spent on planning prior to the grant award, could that spending be considered for the match requirement? And that's a little bit project by project specific, as Mackenzie mentioned earlier in the webinar. So it's dependent on how far or how long ago those planning projects were completed and whether or not they directly related to the preservation work that's being done or the project that's being proposed. You know, if it was completed, if PAR was completed in preparation for larger rehabilitation work and the PAR directly relates to the rehabilitation work, that would count as match. I think we had another question about filling out forms online and how do we enter forms like the ECO for the environmental review. So all of our application materials are available as PDF and Word documents on our website. But when you submit them, you don't submit them via like an online form. You'll just submit them via you know, the PDF or the Word document that you filled out. So I think that might answer that question, but if it doesn't, feel free to re-ask that question. Mackenzie and Tasha, you see any other questions that we should answer? Sorry, I'm trying to read through them as well.
I'm seeing one here about our actual bids for the work to be done required for the application, and just talking about how that would be hard to do because all contractors are busy and many are afraid of historical buildings. So, you know, there doesn't need to be actual bids for the work to be done included in the application, but you do need justification for the cost that you're coming in for of some sort. So that could be if you had someone come in and give you general cost estimates. It doesn't have to be a complete full bid. If someone, an architect or engineer has came in and given you a cost estimate, or a plumber or a heating and cooling expert, just rough estimates, it doesn't have to, like I said, be a full bid, but there has to be some sort of justification for the amount requested.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. I also saw another question, it looks like from Garfield County Museum. They were asking whether a feasibility study comparing updating the current structure and a new build be eligible for funding. Eligible projects have to fall into kind of 3 buckets, and they have to relate to kind of brick and mortar improvement. So a planning component would be eligible, but only for a larger project that's $50,000 or more that kind of has a brick and mortar component of the project. But it wouldn't be eligible just on its own. There was another question too from someone who owns a house and building that are both over 100 years old, that they're currently trying to get registered on the National Register of Historic Places. And the question was, would a building, does a building already need to be registered to receive a grant? And the answer is no. There's 3 ways to qualify as a historic site. But 2 ways are to be listed either individually or as part of a contributing property for a historic district. And then the 3rd way is if the structure is more than 50 years old and has documented significance to the history of a Montana community or region. And you might document that by including a letter of support from the local preservation commission or your county or city's preservation officer. So there's certainly other ways to document the historic importance of a structure. It does not have to be listed to apply to the program. Another question was, if a project is tied to a national park, would that disqualify it? No, we received applications last year. 1 application for a project that was located within Glacier, and that project wasn't qualified. That would certainly be eligible if it meets other program guidelines.
So I'm looking at the question from Morgan here. The question is, if they are purchasing and renovating a historic Main Street building for mixed use, would the purchase of the building count toward the 20% match on a brick and mortar structural improvements project, such as repairing roof, structural and facade? I think that would count towards the match, especially the timing on that was, again, kind of the typical question. If you purchased a building 10 years ago, that wouldn't necessarily count towards match for a project coming in on the cycle, but it sounds like this will be a more recent purchase, and so you can use the acquisition as match for that.
Thanks, Mackenzie. And it looks like there was another question. If a city applies for a grant for a downtown historic district with multiple businesses and buildings as part of that grant, which includes this individual's building, and then that individual also applies as well for a separate project, is that acceptable? And we might need a little bit more information. I think it a little bit depends on kind of the nature of what the city is applying for versus what your organization is applying for. You know, if it's the exact same project, I think we would need to think about that a little bit differently. But if the city, for example, is applying for facade improvements for a couple of downtown properties versus your project is for roof repairs for a historic site, I think that would be okay. But Alyssa, I would just encourage you to maybe reach out to us with a little bit more information about your specific instance or circumstance, and we can provide a little bit more detail. And then it looks like there's another question. We mentioned the funding timeline is approximately 15 months. Is there a timeline for completion of the project after funding? During this past round of MHPG projects in House Bill 12, which is the bill that appropriated funds per project and ranked the projects per the legislature's requirements and how the legislature ultimately landed. They included a date for when projects had to be contracted with Commerce, but there is not currently a date in House Bill 12 for when projects need to be completed. So the quick answer is no, there's not a hard and fast timeline for when projects have to be completed. However, one of the statutory criteria is whether or not your project can move forward in a timely manner after award. So we wouldn't be able to rank a project that isn't going to move forward for 2 years high compared to a project where matching funds are in place and that project can move forward after award. So I hope that answers that question. And then it looks like we have a final question or another question. If I'm not a nonprofit, but my husband has an LLC, could we use that for the applicant, or do you need to be an established business or nonprofit? Again, that might a little bit depend on your specific circumstance, so I would encourage you to reach out to our team either via phone call or an email. But if your husband's LLC was tied to the project, yes, he could apply and be the lead applicant and kind of the fiscal agent for the project on behalf of your project. Again, we might just need a little bit more information. Okay, we'll leave the question and answer open for a couple more minutes if anybody has any remaining questions. I think we were able to either verbally or in writing answer all of the questions that we've had so far. Again, our contact information is up on the screen. We really encourage everybody to give us a call or send us an email if you have questions about your specific project, or even if you simply want to discuss your project. We always love to hear about what potential ideas for projects are across the state. If you run into any issues as you're actually writing your application or submitting it, again, we would encourage you to reach out to us. And we will make this webinar, the recording of this webinar and a PDF of this webinar available on our website in the upcoming weeks. Okay, it doesn't look like we're getting any more questions, and we've gotten a couple of thank yous. So I hope that means for the time being that there's no more questions out there in the audience. Again, if there are, feel free to send us an email or give us a phone call. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the chance to connect with you guys, even if it's via Zoom webinar. Any other thoughts from you, Tosh or Mackenzie?
Quickly, we did have a raised hand. Oh. Nope, maybe it's gone. Nope, I thank everybody for coming, and yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us directly, and we're happy to help out.
Yeah, these were great questions. Thank you. And as you proceed through all the materials and the applications, we do anticipate you probably want to confer with us on details. I think in our responses, we certainly had suggested and welcomed any sort of clarifications. You know, as you can see, there's always kind of new questions. This program is new, so every round we'll see new ideas and new needs. And so certainly, just because you didn't hear something today, don't assume that it's not possible. Feel free to always reach out to us, and we'd be happy to provide clarification, answers, and whatever we can do to help you position yourself as a successful and thorough application. So we really look forward to working with you in the weeks leading up to our deadline.